Margaret's hands trembled as she bent down, turning over one worn folder after another on the desk her late husband had left behind. Outside the window, the rain kept falling in a steady rhythm, mingling with the salty mist driven in from the sea, blurring the view. Her silver hair, already fine and brittle, clung lightly to her cheeks from the damp air. She no longer noticed the chill seeping through the cracks in the window. Her mind was fixed on something else, a thing she had just glimpsed, something she thought had been asleep in the drawer for more than half a century. Lying quietly among the yellowed papers was an old envelope. The paper had softened with the years, its color faded to the sallow of aged skin, and when her fingers brushed it, it gave a faint, brittle whisper, the sound of paper on the verge of crumbling. On the front, the words Eliza Carter stood clear, a strange, unfamiliar name, one she was certain she had never heard before. Margaret paused for a long time. She tilted her head, her pale gray eyes studying every curve of the letters. There was no mistaking it. This was Thomas's handwriting. Even the way he extended a stroke or angled his pen at the end of a word was something she knew by heart. But that familiarity didn't bring the warmth it usually did. This time, it sank through her, cold from the inside out. The postmark in the upper left corner made her freeze. August 1945. That year, she had been only a 12-year-old girl, while Thomas, in his 20s, had been serving in the army. It was a time when they had never met, had never even known the other existed. Margaret lifted the envelope. It was light, almost weightless, yet felt heavy in her palm. She held it close to her nose, breathing in the scent of old paper mixed with the faintest trace of wood, an aroma she had never found in anything else in this house. It was a faraway scent, perhaps from those wartime years Thomas had never spoken of in detail. She remembered the last time she had seen him in this room. It had been an autumn afternoon, the warm gold of the sunlight streaming through the curtain, brushing his shoulders with a dim halo. He had been holding a pen, writing something on a sheet of paper, and when she asked him about it, he had only smiled. Old matters, nothing important. The memory flickered, making her chest ache. In all their years together, Thomas had never once mentioned a woman named Eliza Carter. Not once. She set the envelope down, but her eyes stayed on it, as though afraid it might vanish if she looked away. Outside, the rain thickened, knocking a slow rhythm against the glass. She could hear the waves breaking against the rocky outcrop below the cliff, a sound she knew well, but that today carried a heavier note. She pulled out a chair and sat down. Thomas's desk remained exactly as it had been when he was alive. The left drawer held notebooks, maps, and a few unsent postcards. The right one was crammed with old bills and rusted paper clips. The polished wood surface had dulled where his hands had rested for decades. In the corner still sat his treasured silver pocket watch. Its hands stopped long ago, though Margaret had never replaced the battery. She picked up the envelope again, tilting it under the dim light filtering through the curtain. The stamp was intact, its image slightly blurred, but still recognizable as the emblem of the military post office of the time. The edges of the envelope were worn, a small crease marring the right corner, a sign it had been handled and put away many times. The address on the front was to some far-off town, thousands of miles from here. But what made her stop was the way Thomas had written the very first words, "My dearest Eliza." A strange feeling welled up inside her. She had read many letters Thomas had sent her while away on business, and he always began them with, "My dear Margaret." Only one letter's difference between dear and dearest, yet it opened a gulf she could not see the bottom of. Margaret leaned back in her chair. She did not open the letter, partly because she feared that once she did, everything she had believed throughout their marriage would be changed forever, partly because she wanted to hold on to this moment, the moment when all the answers still lay sleeping behind the paper seal. Outside, the rain now came with wind, making the curtains stir. The light in the room flickered, her shadow stretching long across the wooden floor. She felt as though she was sitting between two worlds. One, the present, with its old age, its loss, its quiet house. The other, Thomas's past, full of things she had never touched. Her fingers brushed over the envelope again, as though she were touching his hand from 50 years ago. The ridges of each letter pressed faintly under her skin, at once familiar and belonging to a stranger. Margaret placed the letter in the top drawer and locked it with the rusted key. She didn't know when she would open it, only that today was not the day. Some secrets, if they are to be understood, must come to you in their own time. She rose and walked to the window. Outside, the sea still roared beneath the cliff, rain dissolving into white spray. Through the mist, she could almost see Thomas's figure, young in his uniform, his back turned, walking toward a place from which she could not call him back. And so that afternoon slipped away, leaving an empty space on the desk and in her heart, a question without an answer.
That night, the rain came hard. It slammed against the windows like 100 urgent fists, making the old wooden frames quiver. In the cold, dim bedroom, only the small desk lamp cast a warm golden pool of light, enough to illuminate every crease on Margaret's face. She lay on her side in bed, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. The wind from the sea slipped through the gap in the door, making the curtains billow, and the sound of the waves mingled with the rain in an endless, mournful symphony. She knew she wouldn't sleep. Ever since leaving the study that afternoon, the image of the old envelope had clung to her mind, like a pair of unseen eyes watching from the dark. Margaret sat up, draping a thin wool scarf over her shoulders. Her bare feet touched the icy wooden floor, sending a shiver up her spine. She stepped out of the bedroom, down the shadowy hallway, and opened the door to the study. In the muted light, everything was exactly as she had left it. The wooden desk, the locked drawer, and the ceaseless rain outside the window. She took out the key and unlocked the drawer. The envelope lay there, motionless, like some forgotten relic of time. Margaret picked it up, light as air, yet heavy as stone in her chest. This time, she didn't hesitate. She carried it back to her room and sat on the edge of the bed. The wind moaned across the roof, making the lamp tremble. Margaret tore the envelope carefully, trying not to shred the fragile paper. A thin sheet, its color faded with age, slid out. She unfolded it and began to read. My dearest Eliza, I write these lines amid the gunfire and dust, not knowing if we will ever have the chance to meet again. I cannot stop thinking of your eyes on that last day when I left. I promised I would return, and I will keep that promise, if the war lets me live. I want you to know I have never forgotten the moment you saved my life. When the bombs fell, I thought it was my last second, but your hand pulled me back, dragged me from the rubble. From that day, I have owed you my life. I swore to myself I would repay that debt in any way I could. I believe we will have a future. I see it every night in my dreams,
a small house by the sea, your laughter echoing from the kitchen, and in the morning, I'll make you coffee, just as I used to. I don't know how long this war will last, but I know my heart has found where it belongs. Wait for me, Eliza. When the war ends, I will come back." The letter ended with a signature, Thomas. No date, only the scent of old ink and the dampness of years gone by. Margaret laid the letter in her lap, her fingers gripping it so tightly her knuckles turned white. In all their life together, Thomas had never written to her in words like these. His letters to her in the early days had been simple, lighthearted, sometimes touched with humor. But here, every word burned, with longing, with pain. There was no mention of Margaret, no sign that she had ever existed in this story. She wondered, who was Eliza Carter? This woman hadn't just known Thomas, she had lived deep within his heart, a place Margaret had never reached. The phrase, "a debt for life," echoed in her mind. She had thought she knew her husband's past, but now an entire part of his life had unfolded before her, one she had never imagined, one completely foreign to her. Margaret folded the letter, slipped it back into the envelope, and placed it on the bedside table. Her gaze turned toward the window, where the rain was still a white curtain and the sea roared relentlessly. Inside her, a new resolve was forming. She had to find out who Eliza Carter was and why Thomas had never spoken her name. On that rain-soaked night, Margaret knew she had just stepped onto a path that might change every memory she had ever cherished of her late husband.
The next morning, the rain had stopped, but the sky was still weighed down by a blanket of heavy gray clouds. From her bedroom window, Margaret gazed out at the sea. The waves rolled wearily toward the rocky shore, leaving behind slow, fading streaks of foam. In her hands, Thomas's letter was neatly folded and sealed inside a small plastic sleeve. She knew she could not ignore it. The old house by the sea had a storage room she rarely entered. It was crammed with wooden crates, old suitcases, and things Thomas had brought home but never put away. Margaret slowly opened the door. The smell of damp wood and years-old dust rose up, making her cough lightly. Sunlight filtered through a small window, hanging in the dusty air like drifting particles of memory. She began to search. Boxes of documents tied with rope, stacks of old journals. Margaret opened them one by one, flipping through the pages, but most were scattered work notes, lists of goods, occasional lines about the weather or news from the radio. Then she saw it, a larger envelope, unsealed, pressed against the side of a worn leather photo album. Inside was a faded photograph. When she pulled it out, she felt herself dragged back into a time long gone. Thomas, at least 40 years younger, dressed in a crisp military uniform, standing beside a young woman with long, dark hair. She wore a simple dress, but her face was radiant. They stood close, not touching, but in Thomas's eyes, as he looked into the camera, was something Margaret had never seen in their own photographs. A warmth mingled with pride, as though this woman was his entire world. Behind them stood a large iron gate with a wooden sign above it, the letters faint but still readable, Fort Hill Barracks. Margaret sat down on the old wooden chair in the storage room, still clutching the photograph. She ran her fingers over the woman's face. The beauty was not sharp or striking, but brimming with life. She wondered, could this be Eliza Carter? The letter from last night, the words, "a debt for life," and now this photograph, they were beginning to fit together like pieces of a picture she could not yet fully see. Margaret decided to take the photo and the letter to the town library.
The library sat on the main street just over a mile from her home, a red brick building from the early 20th century, always wrapped in the scent of paper and old ink. The librarian, Mrs. Harris, was a petite woman well into her 80s, with keen, sharp eyes. When Margaret handed her the photograph, Mrs. Harris put on her reading glasses and examined it closely. "Fort Hill Barracks. I remember this place. It closed right after the war," she murmured, her voice lowering. "And this young woman? Let me think. I believe I've seen her in an old newspaper." Margaret followed her down to the basement, where nearly a century's worth of town newspapers and records were kept. Mrs. Harris sorted through the yellowed stacks, the soft rustle of paper echoing in the quiet. At last, she pulled out a newspaper dated August 18th, 1945. On page 3 was a list of those reported missing after an explosion near Fort Hill Barracks. On the 12th line, it read clearly, "Eliza Carter, 23 years old." Margaret read the name over and over, a strange mix of familiarity and distance washing over her. This was it, the same name printed on the envelope that had lain untouched for 50 years. She left the library with the photograph and the letter in hand, her mind spinning. The question was no longer just who was Eliza Carter, but also, if Eliza had gone missing in 1945, why had Thomas still written to her? And more importantly, how deeply had he loved her? The afternoon sea wind lashed her face as she stepped onto the street. Inside her, suspicion had already taken root, and she knew she would not stop until she uncovered the whole truth. The rain had stopped during the night, leaving glistening puddles along the cobblestone road leading from Margaret's house down to town. That morning, pale sunlight filtered through the early mist, casting everything in a faint silvery dust. Margaret stood in the living room, her fingers lightly brushing the edge of an old photograph she had just placed on the table. Scattered clues lay before her. The yellowed letter in that familiar handwriting. The picture of Thomas with a young woman standing in front of a large iron gate. Above it, a wooden sign with faded but still legible words, Fort Hill Barracks. She had read the letter countless times since that rainy night. The flowing lines, heavy with affection, tinged with regret, and a promise to return after the war haunted her mind. Thomas called the woman Eliza, never once mentioning Margaret's name. And in one passage, he spoke of a debt for life because she had saved him, words that had lingered in Margaret's thoughts ever since. In her memory, Thomas had always been a quiet, steadfast husband devoted to his family. He had never said much about his time in the army, only remarking once that some things are buried with comrades. At the time, she hadn't pressed further. But now, the fragments of the past seemed to demand she piece them together, even if the truth might wound her. Margaret decided to start from the only place that might lead her to Eliza, the house she had lived in before the war. In the old newspaper Margaret had read at the library, there was a 1945 report. Eliza Carter, resident of the southern outskirts of town, missing under unexplained circumstances. That suburb was different now. She recalled the elderly librarian's words from the day before. That house, it's a coffee shop now, but the outer wall and windows are still the same. Margaret slipped on a gray cardigan and stepped outside. The road to the outskirts wound along the coast, waves lapping rhythmically as the scent of salt drifted in the breeze. She had lived in this seaside area for more than 40 years, yet today the road felt strange, as if leading her into a part of her own memory she'd never known. The Shoreline Brew Cafe appeared at the end of a quiet street. Its red brick exterior was still there, only weathered by time. The wooden window frames were painted white, and in the corner, Margaret spotted the detail the librarian had mentioned, a small, round window high above, where a bedroom must once have been. She pushed the door open. Inside, the warmth of wood and the aroma of freshly ground coffee embraced her. There were only a few customers, mostly locals. Margaret chose a table near the wall, her eyes wandering over the black and white photographs hanging there. Among them, one image showed the street in the 1940s, and in the corner, she saw the same house before the coffee sign existed. "Would you like to order something?" a woman's voice asked beside her. Margaret turned. The woman was about 70, with neatly cropped silver hair, wearing a beige cardigan. Her eyes were bright and sharp, as if they still held decades of memory. "Actually, I'm not here for coffee. I'm trying to find out about someone who once lived here. Eliza Carter," Margaret said slowly, almost tentatively. The woman was silent for a moment, then gave a faint smile, not entirely happy. "I used to be Eliza's neighbor. My name's Helen. It's been a long time since anyone's mentioned her." Margaret felt her heartbeat quicken. "You said you knew her before she disappeared?" Helen sat across from her. "Eliza was kind, beautiful, a soft but radiant kind of beauty. After her parents died in an accident, she lived with her younger sister. I still remember the girl, must have been around 10 at the time, thin and shy." Margaret froze. A chill ran down her spine. In her mind, scenes from her own childhood surfaced. Losing her parents in a house fire, living with her older sister, only to lose her when Margaret was 11 years old. The details Helen had just described, the loss of parents, a younger sister, were eerily familiar. "You said Eliza had a sister?" Margaret tried to keep her voice steady, though her hands trembled slightly on the table. "Yes, the girl's name was, let me think, Mary or Margaret? No, that sounds familiar." Helen frowned. "But I remember that after Eliza went missing, her sister was taken in by another family. I don't know what happened after that. It's been too long." Margaret sat in silence for a long moment. The image of Thomas standing before the military barracks rose in my mind again. Fort Hill Barracks. That place was surely connected to what had happened. The letter, the photograph, Helen's account, they all seemed to sketch out a truth she wasn't ready to face. That Thomas may have loved Eliza, and somehow her own life had intersected with the other woman's, not only through him, but perhaps from her earliest years. Helen studied Margaret for a while before speaking softly. "Why are you looking for Eliza if she's been gone so long?" Margaret replied in almost a whisper, "I think I'm looking for a part of my own memory." Outside the cafe, the sea wind had picked up again, carrying the tang of salt. Margaret knew her next step would be to go to Fort Hill Barracks, the place where the photograph was taken, and possibly where all the answers began. The rain from yesterday afternoon still hadn't stopped. On the weathered rooftops of the seaside town, each drop fell like the patient tapping of an invisible hand. Margaret stood by the living room window, clutching a woolen scarf tightly around her shoulders. She gazed outside, where the cobblestone street glistened with water and umbrellas passed by like drifting black dots. The words of the cafe neighbor still echoed in her mind. Eliza, a sister, with a younger sibling who'd gone missing long ago? Those fragments aligned with a chilling precision to the scattered memories of Margaret's childhood, a childhood she'd always believed began as an orphan from the war, brought back from a refugee camp by her adoptive parents. But now, the shiver from the previous night had hardened into a gnawing suspicion. Eliza was not only someone Thomas had once known, She might have been Margaret's own sister. The next morning, Margaret resolved to find answers. She put on her brown raincoat and stepped outside. The air was damp and cold, carrying the mingled scents of sea salt and wet earth. The Civil Records Office sat in the town center, a faded red brick building with peeling white-painted wooden doors and a slightly crooked metal nameplate. When she pushed open the heavy door, the musty scent of old paper and ink enveloped her, as if time had stopped there decades ago. A middle-aged man with silver at his temples looked up from the reception desk. "What records would you like to search?" His voice was low and hoarse, though not unfriendly. Margaret placed on the counter a handwritten note. Name, Eliza Carter. Date of birth, around 1920 to 1923. Location, town outskirts before the war. The man narrowed his eyes, studying her for a few seconds before nodding. "Please wait a moment. We'll check the pre-war archives. It may take some time." Margaret sat in a wooden chair near the window. Outside, the rain drummed against the blurred glass. She rested her chin on her hand, trying to contain the swell of impatience. In her mind, disconnected images returned. Her adoptive mother's gentle smile when she was little, the awkward silences whenever anyone mentioned her biological family, and most vividly, one evening when her adoptive father, drinking alone, had muttered, "You had an older sister, but you'll never meet her." For years, she had dismissed it as drunken talk. Now, the words took on an entirely different weight. From behind a closed door came the sounds of filing drawers opening and papers rustling. About 20 minutes later, the man returned with a worn, pale yellow file in his hands. "We have a record for Eliza Carter, and, to be honest, I'm rather surprised." Margaret gripped the armrest of her chair. "Why?" He opened the file, producing a yellowed birth certificate. Beneath the name Eliza Carter, the parents were listed as Edward Carter, Mary Carter, Nee Lane. Then he turned to another sheet, a missing child report from 1930. Margaret Carter, born 1925, younger sister of Eliza Carter. Margaret went cold. Her own name lay there, beside the words missing, not found. Her heart pounded as her trembling fingers touched the page, as if to be sure it was real. "Mrs. Carter," the man said softly. "According to the record, Eliza searched for her sister for many years, until the war broke out. After that, she was listed as missing in 1945. Margaret swallowed hard. "Do you know if my husband, Thomas, ever served in the same barracks as her?" The man was silent for a moment, then pulled a photograph from the file. It was the same one Margaret had found in the storage room. Thomas, standing beside Eliza, in front of a large iron gate with a wooden sign, the faded letters still readable, Fort Hill Barracks. Margaret stepped out of the records office into the heavy rain. The umbrella shook violently in the wind, but she hardly felt the cold. In her mind, the pieces began to arrange themselves, and the picture they formed left her aching and stunned. Eliza, her biological sister. Thomas, the man she had lived with for nearly half a century, had once loved Eliza before marrying her. And through all those years, he had never said a word. Back home, Margaret sat at Thomas's desk, the place where the story had begun. She opened the drawer and retrieved the old letter. This time, she read slowly, each word cutting deeper. "If I survive, I will come back. But if I cannot, know that I have loved you, Eliza, and always will." Margaret set the letter down, her knuckles whitening as her hands clenched. Part of her wanted to weep for the loss of the past. Another part wanted to scream at the sense of betrayal, even if it was far too late. Outside, the rain kept falling. In the old seaside house, Margaret knew she had found her answer, yet at the same time, that answer had opened another abyss, one in which she would have to face the truth about the man she had once believed had told her everything.
A winter morning, the sky hung low and gray, like an old woolen shawl draped over the whole town. The sea wind from the east blew in, carrying its faint, briny tang, winding through the rows of bare trees along the coastal road. Margaret wrapped a beige scarf around her neck, clutching a slip of paper with the address of a nursing home, one she'd gotten from an old acquaintance of Thomas's. It had been days since she'd pieced together enough of the truth about Eliza and about what her husband had kept hidden. The bus crawled through empty streets, its tires grinding over the damp pavement. Each turn tightened the knot in her chest. The man she was about to meet, Charles Keating, had once been Thomas's close comrade at Fort Hill Barracks. Now in his 80s, his health was frail, but his memory sharp. He was one of the last living witnesses to those brutal war years. Margaret stepped down before the nursing home gate. The 3-story, weathered gray building sat modestly within a small garden. The tall iron fence rusted in places. A young nurse greeted her with a smile and led her down a long hallway tinged with the scent of disinfectant. The rubber soles of their shoes echoed against the old tiled floor. Charles sat in the corner of the common room, beside a large window. The pale winter light fell over his snow-white hair and the deep lines of his face. When Margaret approached, he looked up, and a flicker of surprise crossed his pale blue eyes. "You are." His voice was rough, yet warm. "I'm Margaret, Thomas Carter's wife," she replied, forcing her tone to stay steady. The name lit his eyes briefly before they dimmed again, as if an old memory had surfaced and sunk back. He gestured for her to sit. "Thomas, that brother of mine. I never thought I'd meet anyone from his family again. What brings you here?" Margaret placed an old envelope gently on the table. "I'm looking for information about Eliza Carter. You knew her, didn't you?" He stared at the envelope for a long moment before nodding slowly. "Yes, Eliza. A strong woman, willing to do anything to save the one she loved." Margaret stayed silent, gripping the handle of her bag. "Back then," Charles began speaking slowly, "we were stationed at Fort Hill Barracks, not far from this town. Thomas and Eliza, they were close. Anyone could see the way he looked at them. They were a couple, if you can call it that." Margaret swallowed. "And what happened?" "One night in October 1945, the barracks came under shell fire. Smoke, explosions. Thomas and I ran to the wooden housing where Eliza was staying. But just as we got there, a shell hit the roof. The whole place went up in flames, smoke everywhere. In the chaos, Thomas saw you." Charles paused, studying Margaret's face. "You, Margaret. You were lying unconscious near the back fence, only slightly wounded. Thomas rushed to pull you out before the entire section exploded." Margaret's mouth opened. "But Eliza?" "When Thomas went back, the fire had engulfed everything. Everyone thought she'd died. But weeks later, I got word, secretly, that she had survived. Badly hurt, but rescued by a group of civilians and taken elsewhere. She left a message for Thomas to stay with you." Margaret felt a sharp ache in her chest. "Why?" Charles gazed out the window, his voice heavy. "Eliza knew Thomas would never abandon you, the woman he'd save with his own life. And she said you were still so young, that you needed someone to protect you. She chose to disappear so Thomas wouldn't have to choose between love and duty." The room fell silent. Outside, wind hissed through the brittle branches.
Margaret felt as if she were hearing a story from another world, a world where love and sacrifice tangled into a knot that had pulled tight for half a century. "Do you know where Eliza went?" she asked, her voice almost a whisper. "Not for sure," Charles shook his head. "Only that after the war, she left this state. Some said they saw her on the West Coast, but no one ever made contact." Margaret stood, taking the envelope in hand. A new resolve flashed in her eyes. "Thank you, Charles. I have to find her." When she stepped out of the nursing home, the cold wind slapped her face, making her feel sharper, more awake than ever before. The last pieces of the puzzle were clear now. Thomas's first love, Eliza's sacrifice, and the truth that her marriage had begun in a moment of life and death. That night, Margaret sat at her desk, the warm yellow lamplight spilling over a stack of blank paper. She began writing down everything she knew, every detail, every date. She would find Eliza, not to accuse her, but to say thank you. Beyond the window, the sea's waves kept beating steadily against the rocky shore. Somewhere in the world, Margaret knew Eliza was still alive, and she would not stop until she found the sister she had lost for half a lifetime. The rain had been falling for 3 days straight. The town seemed wrapped in a damp silver veil, the streets nearly empty, puddles reflecting the yellow glow from the few shops still open. Margaret stood by the window of the old house, her fingers unconsciously touching the worn photograph of Eliza she had carried ever since learning the truth. For weeks, she had searched without rest, walking streets she'd never seen before, knocking on doors where no one remembered a woman named Eliza Carter. And then, yesterday afternoon, a phone call from a social worker had changed everything. The woman's voice on the line was low and hesitant. "You're looking for Mrs. Eliza Carter? I think she's here, at a nursing home outside town." Margaret hadn't asked how she knew. She simply asked for the address, wrote it on a scrap of paper, and slipped it into her cardigan pocket. This morning, Margaret left home early. The rain still fell, drops trailing down the car windows in long streaks. The road to the outskirts narrowed the farther she went, bare winter trees on either side stretching thin, bony branches toward each other. She gripped the steering wheel tightly, her breath steady, but her heart racing, part of her afraid, part of her hopeful. When the weathered wooden sign emerged through the mist, she slowed. Riverside Care Home. The faded lettering was almost hidden by moss and time. The nursing home was a simple 2-story red brick building with a low roof and square windows. The air held the scent of damp earth, mixed faintly with the fragrance of tea from somewhere unseen. The nurse on duty led her down a long hallway, the wooden floor creaking softly underfoot. Warm, muted light fell from ceiling lamps. Behind each door they passed was a glimpse of slow, quiet lives. An old man reading the paper through thick glasses, an elderly woman knitting a scarf, a radio humming a song from the 1940s. Finally, the nurse stopped before the last room at the end of the hall. The door was ajar. "She's in here, but Mrs. Eliza is very weak." Margaret drew in a deep breath and pushed the door open. Inside, the dim light through the rain-streaked window casted gentle gray over the simple furnishings. A single bed, a small wooden table with a vase of white chrysanthemums, and an old armchair by the window. The woman seated there had her face turned outward, watching the raindrops slide down the glass. Though her hair was pure white now, her frame frail, her hands lined with age, Margaret recognized her instantly. That posture, the curve of those shoulders, just as in the old photograph, except the eyes now carried the weight of nearly a century. "Eliza," Margaret whispered, her voice trembling. The woman slowly turned. Her blue eyes, though clouded, lit with a flicker of emotion. Her lips moved, then curved into a faint smile, as if she had waited her whole life for this moment. "Margaret, you've grown so much." No one explained, no one asked how they knew. They recognized each other instantly, as though the blood tie had never been severed. Margaret stepped forward, kneeling by the chair, taking Eliza's cold hand in hers. "It's really you?" Eliza nodded. "I've been watching over you from afar, even when you didn't know I existed." Their conversation unfolded in the steady rhythm of the falling rain. Eliza told her how, after the explosion, everyone believed she had died. In truth, she had been rescued and hidden by a farming family. If she returned to the barracks, she risked capture for some secret missions she had undertaken. Thomas had chosen to save Margaret because she was still young with a life ahead of her. Eliza had known and left that place beside Thomas for her sister as a way to protect her. Margaret listened, her chest tight. She understood now that her marriage had begun from a silent sacrifice. Eliza had vanished completely so her younger sister would never have to live under the shadow of loss or guilt. Outside, the rain tapped against the glass like soft knocks. In the small room, the two sisters sat together, hands clasped over one another, needing no more words. Tears fell, mingling with the sound of the rain, blurring the lines between past and present.
The rain had begun early, the first drops landing softly on the nursing home's tiled roof, making a low, mournful sound like the whispers of time. Margaret sat beside Eliza's bed, her sister's trembling hand resting lightly on hers, thin and dry, yet strangely warm. Beside them lay an old yellow envelope, its edges curled slightly as though it had endured many years. "Keep this," Eliza said, her voice hoarse but each word clear. "This letter, I wrote it right after the explosion, but I never dared to send it. Perhaps now is the right time." Margaret took the envelope. With just a touch, she could feel its weight, not from the paper, but from what was inside. Eliza smiled faintly, her eyes blurred, whether from tears or from the rain falling outside the window. She drew a deep breath. "I always watched over you, from afar. I didn't want you to live with the ghosts of the past. You deserved to be happy. And Thomas, he thought so too." Margaret's throat tightened. She wanted to say she forgave her, that she was grateful for everything, but the words wouldn't come. She only gripped Eliza's hand more tightly, as though letting go would cause everything to fade. The letter opened with the scent of old paper, tinged with the faint mustiness of time. Eliza's handwriting leaned gently to one side, steady but trembling in the last lines. "My dearest Margaret, by the time you read this, I may be far away. I want you to know that in that final moment, in the smoke and fire, I chose for Thomas to save you. Not because I wanted to give up, but because I knew you were the one he needed to protect more than anyone. I saw the way he looked at you. That gaze was never meant for me. And that did not make me resent you. It only made me understand that true love is letting the one you love be happy, even if it's with someone else. I left carrying a piece of my heart, but leaving all the good things for you. I only wish for one thing, that you live fully, without regret, without guilt. Forgive me, and forgive yourself if one day this truth causes you pain. Your sister, Eliza." When she finished reading, her vision blurred. Whether from the rain hitting the window or from tears spilling over, she couldn't tell. Outside, the rain grew heavier, striking the glass like the urgent heartbeat of someone trying to hold on to their final moments. Eliza squeezed her hand one last time, light like a bird's wing. "You brought happiness to Thomas, and to me. I just want you to remember that." Margaret nodded, but before she could reply, Eliza's hand slowly cooled. She remained there, holding it, until a nurse gently touched her shoulder and told her Eliza had passed peacefully. Weeks later, Margaret stood alone in the seaside cemetery. The wind carried the salt of the ocean, waves breaking in the steady rhythm of an old song. Before her lay two graves side by side, Thomas's and Eliza's. She knelt, placing the letter, now sealed in a waterproof pouch, on the earth before Thomas's grave. "You loved both of us, and I know you suffered just as we did. But now, everything is at peace." The rain began again, but this time Margaret didn't feel cold. The drops mixed with her tears, blurring the line between sorrow and serenity. She stood for a long time, listening to the waves, the wind, and feeling as though they were both still there, not in the past, but here, in the present, beside her. When she left the cemetery, she didn't look back, not because she had forgotten, but because she knew that memory and love would always be ahead of her, walking with her until her last days. The story ends, but its echo lingers, like the gentle patter of rain on the eaves, like a letter that will never be lost. Some bonds surpass time, war, and even death, just to tell us that love and sacrifice always remain, no matter the form they take. May your heart always stay open to receive the gentlest things in life.